First time I moved was when I moved out of my parents' house. Growing up, we had lived in the same house my whole life. It was a good house. I had the bedroom in the middle for most of my life, and we had a nice backyard, and it was wonderful. But when I moved out, I found myself living in a school dorm for a year, which was not the best experience of living I've ever had, I have to admit. It wasn't my favorite place to live. And I found that after I had moved out the first time, I ended up moving a lot in my life. In fact, until we moved to Ottawa, my wife and I moved on a very regular basis. There were years where I moved into 3 different places. The year before I got married, I had an apartment, and then we were going to get married, so I decided to end my lease, and then I lived with a friend for a little while, and then we got married, so we moved in together. 3 places in 1 year. And then after that, it seemed like almost every year, Jill and I would find a new place to live until we had kids. Then it was every year and a half. And then we moved to one place and we stayed there for 3 years, and that was wonderful. And then we moved to Ottawa and we stayed in the same place for 6 years until we moved into our home now. We moved a lot. And it wasn't for any really good reason. Sometimes it was a nicer apartment or whatever. There was nothing really bad about it, but it was completely different from what I had grown up with. I had grown up with the same house. I switched rooms once with my sisters, but in general, I was in the same place for my whole life, or at least half of my life. And then change started to happen so much more. I don't know about you, but sometimes when you start with one change, it seems like more changes keep happening, maybe on a more consistent basis. Maybe it's with moving. Maybe when you moved, it became hard to find the best place for you after that, so you kept moving as well. Maybe it's with jobs. Maybe you always keep looking at your jobs going, I wonder if this could be better. So you start looking and changing into new jobs. All of us go through change. We talked about that last week. There are 2 constants in life. That is God, who doesn't change, and change, which always changes. There's nothing else in our lives that are guaranteed except for those 2 things. And when it comes to change, a lot of us struggle with it. Maybe you were not like me. You stayed in your same house for your whole life. You've never left. Maybe you are a lot like me and you moved around a lot as well. All of us deal with change differently. But change doesn't really care. Change is going to happen no matter what. Ready or not, change is always going to hit us. So the question becomes not if we're going to change or if change will happen, but how do we handle change? As we talked about last week, if you were with us, there are different ways we handle change, and some of us really struggle with it. But the truth is, if we dig a little deeper, it's not actually the change that we're struggling with. It's what comes from the change and how it affects us. Change is neutral. It just happens. Sometimes we can try to control it. Sometimes it will happen to us. But how we react to it is where we do have power, where we do have control. And how we feel about it is something that we can put into process and make wise choices about. Because the truth isn't about how we handle change, but rather, how do we handle stress, which is caused by change? Many years ago, I think it was 1967, 2 doctors came up with a stress inventory, the Holmes and Rahe stress inventory. And you might be familiar with it. And what it basically does, it gives you 43 scenarios that we all go through that cause stress. And we go through them because there's a change that's involved. The highest stress is when we lose a loved one. Particularly, they would say a spouse. When your spouse dies, that is probably the highest stress level you will go through. But there are other stressors in there as well. Changing jobs, moving, having children, getting married, spending more time with family, spending less time with family. They even included getting a traffic ticket as a stressor because there's a change that's involved and it causes us to react inside. One of the ones that's on there, which is a bit surprising, but it was 1967, is a change in church activities. Now, if we were to take this stress test, and you'll find a link to it in the comment section, you would probably see that there's a lot of different things going on right now in your life that are causing you stress. Now, there are things that we cannot necessarily control, but we're experiencing the stress. As I look at the list myself, I can see things like not spending as much time in social gatherings, change in church activities, change in job activities. All these things are great stressors, and they're rooted in a change that's occurred. So the question isn't how do we handle the change, but how do we handle the stress that comes from change? Because I believe that all of us are experiencing that right now. We can't control the changes that are going on around us, even if we'd like to, but we can control how we react to the stress. So how do we do that? How do we handle the stress related to change? We know that when we experience stress, it can be very painful on our bodies. We can have struggles with our mind. We can develop depression. Our physical bodies can become tired. We struggle with sleeping. There's all kinds of different things that our body reacts to because of stress. And so how we handle it could change our life in a very positive way. I believe that Jesus came so that we can have life in all of its fullness. And it's hard to have a life in all of its fullness when we're feeling stressed out all the time because of changes around us. So how do we handle it? One of the best examples of it, I think, is actually found in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul. Some of you who are familiar with the New Testament, you know the Apostle Paul is someone who went through a great change in his life. And I'd imagine it would have caused a lot of stress. If you read through the book of Acts, you will read how Paul had an encounter with the risen Jesus and his life changed forever. Before that, he was someone who would be a negative force towards the church. He would persecute them. He would try to get them in trouble. He would even try to get them killed. But when he encountered Jesus, his life changed forever. Can you imagine what that kind of change would have done in your life? Imagine being accepted in one group because you were hateful, because you were against something else, and all of a sudden you become for that thing you were against. How hard would it be to be around those people again? You would lose your community. You would lose your friends. You might even lose your family. But that big stressor, that big change, could be used for good. In fact, it is used for good because years later, almost 2,000 years later, we are reading about the Apostle Paul and gaining insight into how we can handle big changes in our lives and the stresses it causes. So the Apostle Paul wrote a variety of letters to churches that he started and some that he didn't start. He was someone who was a carer for the leaders in the communities. He wanted to make sure they understood the significance that Jesus' death and resurrection could make and did make in their lives. And so he would write to churches to make sure they understood what they believed and why they believed it. He would challenge them when they were making choices that were wrong and not reflecting following Jesus. And he would encourage them when they were doing well. He would visit in person and he would also write. And so at one point, he writes a letter to the church in Corinth. In fact, he actually wrote 3 letters that we have believed written to Corinth. Unfortunately, we only have 2 of them in our New Testament. The second letter, 2 Corinthians, is actually probably the 3rd letter he wrote to this church. And in this 3rd letter, he's not dealing with the same things he dealt with earlier on. If you're familiar with 1 Corinthians, and we spent a long time studying it here at Bromley, it's all about how the church is making big mistakes in how to follow Jesus. He's saying, this is what's wrong with the church. You need to shift, you need to change, you need to follow Jesus. By the time he writes the 2nd letter, it's more about who they are and understanding why those shifts are so essential in their lives. And he's challenged them to understand how to keep their focus, perspective on the right things when they experience the challenges and stresses of change all around them. And so the Apostle Paul, at this point in his life, has been following Jesus for quite a while. He's been following Jesus, we don't know the exact length of time at this point, but most of his life at this point. We believe he became a Christian around the age of 24. Eventually he dies around the age of 60-something through an execution. And so the Apostle Paul writes to this church in Corinth again. And he wants them to understand that even though there are great changes, great stressors all around them, that maybe it feels like everything is falling in on them and there's loss of hope, that if they keep the right focus, they can handle whatever comes their way, no matter how great or how little the changes. So let's understand a little bit more about Paul. At this point that he is writing, we've heard that he has been multiple times, maybe about 5 times, he's been whipped with 39 lashes. This is a great torture that they would put on people who were the enemies of the empire. As well, he's been beaten with rods 3 times, sometimes by religious leaders. He's been attacked and pummeled with stones once. He's been shipwrecked at some point. He has been adrift at sea for a day and a night. He's been traveling all around. He's not no solid home. He's always traveling. He's been in danger by robbers. He's been in danger from his own people, the Jews. He's been in danger by Gentiles. He's been in danger in the city. He's been in danger in the wilderness. He's been in danger at sea. He's had danger from people who say they follow Jesus but don't really follow Jesus. He has had an incredible amount of pain and suffering. He's had many sleepless nights. He has been thirsty. He has been hungry often. He has been in jail. And he's feeling the anxiety probably every day of caring for God's church. And so Paul has all these pressures on his life, all these stressors, all these constant changes going on. And if you read his story over and over again through the letters he's written and through the book of Acts, you see that he kept going. How? Well, I think he gives us the answer in 2 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 to 18, he writes this. Therefore, we do not lose heart. So think about this. Paul who has been persecuted, Paul who has been in jail, Paul who has been beaten, Paul who has been thirsty, Paul who's been hungry, Paul who's been hated by people who should be loving him, people he's helped and people he hasn't helped, people he knows and people he doesn't know. He has gone through so much pain and suffering at this point, so much change and stress. And he says, we, me and you, do not lose heart. Do not lose heart. This church in Corinth was losing heart. They were feeling like, gosh, look at what's happening to Paul. Look at all the changes we've had to do and how much of a struggle it was. Paul is no better for it, they think. Well, he says, no, what? No, don't lose heart. Don't give up. Don't lose heart. This is so important. As you are going through changes right now, as you are experiencing this struggle of maybe isolation, you miss being around people you love. Maybe the fear of the unknown virus that's out there. All these changes, all these struggles, all the work changes, all the family changes, all the dynamics, good and bad. Good and bad, they both cause stress. They're both hard. Do not lose heart. Do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. Paul has this perspective that yes, our bodies are tired, are changing. Look in the mirror today. I bet you if you look in the mirror 1 month from now, your body is going to look a little different. Every day we look in the mirror, we look at pictures of ourselves from the past. We have changed. Our bodies are growing older, growing more tired. They're wasting away. But do not lose heart. This is a reality of life right now. Our bodies are not perfect. Our bodies fail us. I know many of you this week, as I've talked to you on the phone or heard from others, that you've had some real struggles with your bodies. You've gone through some injuries, you've gone through some health scares. Our bodies are perishing. That's part of the right now of our lives. But do not lose heart. Every day as your body grows older, your spirit is being renewed inwardly. You are constantly becoming more and more who you've always been meant to be. No matter how old you are, it does not matter. God is making you who you've always been meant to be. And as much as your body may be failing you, you are still secure with God. For our light and momentary troubles. So think about this again. Paul, who's been beaten, who's been in jail, who's been hungry, who's been suffering, who's been isolated, who's been going through all these horrible things, he calls his troubles light. No big deal. No big deal. If you went through that stress inventory, Paul would probably score a perfect score. He's probably gone through almost everything on there that would hurt him and cause him stress. But he says it's light. It's light. It's momentary. He says, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us eternal glory that far outweighs them all. What we are going through is shaping us. The change, the stress is shaping us for something so much better. Paul repeatedly talks about how our bodies will be glorified. The resurrection of the body in the end is that there is a life greater than we understand, but we have not fully experienced it yet. And we keep going through what we go through as our bodies, as our spirits are being reshaped into who God always invited us to be. And the light and momentary troubles we are experiencing are going to reveal themselves to be so much more than we ever understood. This is a hard perspective to have, because when we feel change, the stress that's caused by change, the pain, the suffering, all those things around us that we do not want, chances are all we focus is on how we don't want it, how this is not how it should be. And so we struggle with that. We struggle with the reality that right now things are not the way they should be, and we're not happy about it. And if our focus only goes to that, stress will get us. Change will consume us. We will miss out on the goodness of life right now that we can have, because we're so focused on how everything is affecting us right now, and we're losing a perspective on what is so much better than we could imagine. Paul is going to continue, and this is his really important point. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Paul is making a very important distinction. What you experience right now is temporary, but there is eternity in the balance. What is unseen, who is unseen? God is eternal. The resurrection of the dead is eternal. The hope beyond what we understand this world to be is eternal. There are things we experience right now, and they can consume us, they can drag us down, they can give us a high score on a stress indicator, they can make us miserable. We can feel alone, we can feel angry, we can feel sad. But those experiences, if we're only focusing on those things and not having a perspective of the eternal, it'll bring us down. It'll make us miserable. We will not have life in its fullness. How do you handle change? Well, it's a matter of how you handle stress. And the biggest factor is to shift your perspective from what is temporary to what is eternal. So we have to think to ourselves, what is eternal? Obviously, God is, for sure. You can't escape that. As I said last week, there's two constants: the God who doesn't change and the change that always changes. The God who doesn't change is who is eternal. Fix your eyes to that God. Through Jesus, we can know God in ways we never could have imagined before. By understanding that Jesus is Lord, that through his death and his resurrection, you have experienced the forgiveness of sins, and the renewal of creation is in the works, that you are offered life in all of its fullness, that he is King of the universe, and you get to be part of that kingdom. You can fix your eyes on the eternal, of what is to come, and so that when you're in the right now, you can experience the goodness of God in all you go through. Paul, who's been beaten, who's been bruised, who's almost died, who's had people die, who's been hurt, who's been ostracized, who's been isolated, who's been in jail, who's been hungry, who's been thirsty, who's been threatened by people, who has, felt alone, says, this is temporary. This isn't that much in the grand scheme of things. What we experience right now is like this big compared to a sense of eternity. Now hold your hands up just this big, just imagine. So that's about 4 or 5, maybe 6 centimeters, okay? So this is your life. Maybe 6 centimeters is your life. It doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter. But now imagine, okay? Now imagine you stretch out your arms. I don't even know if my arms will fit the whole screen. And you stretch them out. How much more, and say that's all of time, that's eternity. Your spot is so tiny. And in fact, my arms do not express eternity well. There's so much more to be focused on than just right now. Right now is temporary. So what is going to last? There are 2 primary things that I think we need to focus on. First one is God. We need to understand who God is, why He loves us, why He created you in His image, why He chose to continuously invite us to know Him and to be changed by Him to be more and more who we've always been meant to be. Why He sent Jesus for us because we couldn't do it on our own. And why He gives us the Holy Spirit now so that we are not alone when we feel alone. That God is always, always with us. We need to focus on God, who is eternal, who is unchanging, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and who loves you, and that doesn't change. The second part I believe we need to focus on is relationships. Jesus said that all of the law, all of the instructions of God come down to 2 things. Love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. So everything you are, focus on God. He is who is eternal. He is who does not change. Then love your neighbor as yourself. How you love your neighbor is a reflection of how you love God. When you love God with all that you are, you realize that it's not just about what I'm experiencing now or how I'm feeling or what I'm going through, but you have a perspective that there is something bigger in this world. And that bigger is expressed through our relationships. That through our love for God, we are expressing that by loving people around us. Not that it's easy, but it's what we do. In fact, that's the only thing that followers of Jesus are asked to do, to love God and love their neighbors as they love themselves. And remember, that includes loving yourself. That's all followers of Jesus are asked to do. That our whole life should be reflecting this. Whether we're going to work or whether we're staying home. Whether there's a pandemic or there's not. Whether we can meet in a church building or just meet online. Whether we have to wear a mask and gloves at a store or we get order pickup from the store. Whatever we're doing, we should be loving God and loving our neighbors as ourselves. And the biggest thing to remember in that is that as things change, as things cause stress, if you put your focus on the eternal, on God, and take that focus away from you, it becomes so much more easy to handle. Our piece of history is so tiny, but God's is so vast. And we get to play this small part right now and join Him in all that He's doing. Change is hard. There's no way around it. But we need to shift our focus from what is temporary to what is eternal and prioritize our movements, our lives, our thoughts around what Jesus says really matters, to love God and love our neighbors ourselves. So how do you handle change? How do you handle stress? You shift your focus from the temporary to the eternal, and then you act on it by loving God and loving your neighbors as yourselves. The writer of Ecclesiastes, we talked about Ecclesiastes last week, was a man of great wisdom, Solomon. And as Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, he really wanted us to understand change, understand what matters, and have that focus on what is eternal in life. In chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, who calls himself the teacher here, says this. He says, "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark, the clouds return after the rain, when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those looking through the window grow dim, when the doors to the street are closed and the sound of grinding fades, when people rise up at the sound of birds, but all the songs grow faint, when people are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets, when the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire no longer is stirred, then people go to their eternal home, and mourners go about the streets. Remember him before the silver cord is severed, and the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring, and the wheel broken at the well. And the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. That word meaningless, and I said this last week if you joined us online, that word would be better translated as mist, something you cannot hold on to. He's saying as he's writing this poem, as he's writing this piece of wisdom, he's saying, remember God before you get to that point where everything just seems like it's fading away. Remember God early in your life. Remember God always in your life. Because everything else we chase after, everything else is just mist. We cannot hold on to it. As all the changes are going on in our lives, we cannot hold on to it. As I listen to the radio this week, as I hear about new cases of COVID-19, as I hear about employers saying, hey, maybe we won't return to physical buildings anymore, and we hear about how it's changing everything around us, we cannot hold on to any of that. But we can hold on to what is eternal. To handle change, we need to shift our focus from what is temporary to what is eternal. Because we can't hold on to anything here. We can only hold on to God. So ask yourself, what will last? What will last in your life? Choose that in these times of change, when change causes stress, to shift your focus from what is temporary and causing that stress to what is eternal and never changes. Shift your focus to Jesus. Remember him. And choose to love God with all you have and to love your neighbor as yourself. And I can guarantee you, when you choose to make that choice, the stress from change doesn't go away, but becomes so much more manageable. And life can be experienced in all of its fullness.